Let me welcome you to episode 10 of our reflections on the Psalms. And I'm going to start straight away just by reading this psalm to you. I think when we come to this particular psalm, which is going to be the 10th psalm, we are dealing with something that not only David, but every single believer has struggled with down through the ages. It's a perennial bugbearer, if you like, because none of us have really come up with any conclusive answers as to how we deal with it. And you'll understand what I mean after we've read the psalm and begin to open it up. So Psalm 10 begins like this. Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? You're beginning to get the picture. How often have we prayed prayers like that? In arrogance, the wicked persecute the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes they have devised. For the wicked boast of the desires of their heart. Those greedy for gain curse and renounce the Lord. In the pride of their countenance, the wicked say, God will not seek it out. All their thoughts are, there is no God. Their ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of their sight. As for their foes, they scoff at them. They think in their heart, we shall not be moved. Throughout all generations, we shall not meet adversity. Their mouths are filled with cursing and deceit and oppression. Under their tongues are mischief and iniquity. They sit in ambush in the villages. In hiding places, they murder the innocent. Their eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. They lurk in secret like a lion in its covert. They lurk that they may seize the power. They seize the power and drag them off in their net. They stoop, they crouch, and the helpless fall by their might. They think in their heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. Rise up, O Lord. O God, lift up your hand, do not forget the oppressed. Why do the wicked renounce God, and say in their hearts, you will not call us to account? But you do see, indeed you note the trouble and grief, that you may take it into your hands. The helpless commit themselves to you. You have been the helper of the orphan. Break the arm of the wicked and evildoers. Seek out their wickedness until you find more. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations shall perish from his land. O Lord, you will hear the desire of the meek. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to do justice for the orphan and the oppressed, so that those from earth may strike terror no more. It's an interesting psalm, Psalm 10, and there is one predominant driving theme, disturbing theme, difficult theme as you look through this psalm, and it's this: God's invisibility, God's relative silence. There is not a person on earth who's been a Christian for any amount of time who cannot relate to that dilemma. There has been moments in my life, and I'm absolutely sure moments in yours, where you have felt the frustration and the anguish and the disappointment of God's invisibility. Why doesn't God do something about this? That's probably been a question you've asked yourself. Why doesn't God step in? Why doesn't God change this? I have no doubt you have battled with those complex questions in times past. And when you look at this psalm as we did together, from verses 12 to 18, God's silence is painted from the perspective of the believer, how they cope with that. And then in verses 2 to 11, it's the problem as it's seen from a non-believer, those who have very little interest, if any at all, in God. From a non-believer's perspective, which is where we begin from 2 to 11, the fact that God is silent is rather good news. To them, it means that they have a source of joy and confidence. They're not accountable. They don't have to worry about any divine intervention. They don't have to worry about any potential divine judgment. To them, God is somebody who's just a figment of the imagination of the weak. They need something to lean on. They need a crutch. Therefore, they've invented or created an almighty God. But in reality, he's just not there. He's absent. And so to them, it draws that sense of pride and arrogance. God is not seen, and God will not hear, and God will not get involved. And that was the mentality that David is trying to reflect. For them, there was no divine plan. There was no great accountability. There was certainly no end-time judgment to be feared. But from the believer, it's a very different perspective. As we look into verses 12 to 18, it's a great source of pain. It's a great source of heaviness and perplexity, because there is no answer to it. There is an element in which we struggle with the whole idea of God not being present in our times of greatest need. And it's something that there isn't an ABC answer to. For the believer, God's silence is a point of grief. It's like losing someone dear to you when you anticipate them being there. It's a great deal of chaos and confusion because there is no answer as to why God is silent at times and absent at others. It is I think, a point of frustration also. Who among us hasn't got angry at the thought that God is not doing what we thought he would do? He's not rushing in to save the day. He's not rushing in to nail those who are persecuting us and causing great wickedness in the earth. And so it's a real complex problem for the believer. Because for what the believer has is that he believes God does see, God does hear, and God will act. And so they have to balance that confidence with the present, often immediate reality that God isn't hearing, and he doesn't appear to be seeing, and he certainly isn't acting. And that becomes very difficult. So first of all, you have to look at the non-believer. There is an air of great arrogance and pride as they do look at this. David says, in the pride of their countenance, the wicked say, God will not seek. All of their thoughts are, there is no God. That's an outlandish statement to make, isn't it? But nobody's making that based on theological insight. These fellas haven't studied scriptures and ancient writings and come up with the conclusion that basically God will not seek them out for doing wrong and that there's no God. They've based that on experiential. They've based it on the fact that they can't see any God intervening. They can't see any accountability being necessary. And as a result of that, they say, well, then there isn't a God. We shall not be moved, it says in those verses. We shall not meet adversity. These are what we read in verses 2 to 11. The non-believer was convinced that it made no relevance whatsoever. God was not involved in their lives. Neither was he interested, so it doesn't really matter what they do. It's about pleasing number one, doing what's right for you. How often do we see some 3,000-4,000 years later, exactly the same mentality coming out in the people that we meet? No God, no accountability, no judgment, do what you want. Really doesn't matter. God won't seek me out, God won't hold me to account, there is no God after all. That is not a new way of thinking. It's an ancient way of thinking, but it's a very arrogant way of thinking because we're making huge assumptions. I think it was one particular atheist who was asked on a scale of 1 to 10 what he believed there was a God or not. And he said that basically he was 10 being that there was a God and 1 being no God at all. He said the nearest he could get was probably 9 because he couldn't prove that there was no God. But in fact, he was convinced that perhaps there wasn't. And this is the same situation we find in these non-believers that David talks about. They are people who, when we read at verses 7 and 8, are playing by their own rules. And inevitably, that's exploitation, that's abuse, that's an unjust system, an oppressive system. And that's what they were living like. The ultimate conclusion in verse 11 is this: God has forgotten. In reality, he's hidden his face and God will never see it. That's the fundamental belief that these people are carrying. The belief that somehow their thoughts and their actions go invisible to God. Which then brings you to the second cluster of verses, which then defines how the believer sees the whole absence of God thing. It's not an easy thing to digest. On the one side, you have arrogance, evil and pride of man. On the other side, you have the inactivity and silence of God, and we never assume the two should go together. Wherever there is rampant evil, there will be an active God. Wherever there is unlicensed pain, there will be a God who hears and is active and is present. The thought that these things can be going on in the world and we can have this dreadful activity of sinfulness, and yet God seems silent, is a strange thing for us to really get a hold of. And equally so, David is saying the same thing. But the interesting thing about David is that he's not coming at it from a perspective of saying, well, I'm not really too sure whether God will act. I'm not really too sure whether God's present. I'd like to think he is, but maybe he's not. What strikes you in David's words is he's not speaking as a man from a point of desperation. He's speaking from a point of confidence. He's not appealing to God as much as declaring the God who is. David is confident that God will prove the naysayers and the wicked wrong. So look at these verses. Verse 12, he says, "Rise up, O Lord, lift up your head, your hand." Verse 14, "You do see, indeed you note trouble and grief." This is David saying, my experience is very different to what these unbelievers are declaring. In verse 17, he says, "You will hear, you will strengthen." In verse 18, "You will do justice." These are the driving themes that David has. How does he keep that confidence in the face of what you might say contradictory evidence? David could well have been led into the understanding that however much he's confident, do you see God acting? Do you see God doing anything, David? So why the confidence? There was something in the story of David's life, there was something in his heart that told him there was more going on that was seen or appreciated, and that's what we find. Elie Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz. He went on to write a number of books and become a significant voice in the whole justice for others. And in his particular book he wrote called Night, he reflects on a particular instance in the camp one day when the Nazis were randomly hanging people for no apparent reason. He gives the story of a young boy, possibly only in his mid-teens, being selected and then led to the gallows and then hung from his neck. And a voice behind Wiesel said, "Where is God? Where is God?" Watching this young boy struggling for the last moments of his life. And Elie Wiesel thought to himself, there is God hanging from the gallows. Now to some that may not be a great deal of comfort, but the reality is that God doesn't always appear in the antidote to pain. Oftentimes he appears in the pain. It's not always that God comes riding on the white horse, leading the cavalry, and deliverance is thrown out left, right and centre. Sometimes God is involved in the most difficult parts of our lives. He is walking the journey with us. He's not taking us out of it. And that's what we find. How do we deal with God's silence, God's apparent inactivity, God's apparent absence? I love what C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, A Grief Observed, when he was going through possibly one of the most painful moments of his own life in the loss of his wife. He said, "It is not ceasing to believe in God that is the problem, but coming to believe dreadful things about him." That's an incredible, interesting thought, isn't it? Our danger as believers is not that we will stop believing in God because he doesn't turn up when we need him to, or he doesn't answer our prayers when we need him to. The big danger with God is that those experiences begin to contort and dilute our understanding of God, so that the God we begin to believe in is not a God of great goodness, but something very different. And that's the big danger. In the same way, we walk this fragile tightrope, if you like. We're believing that God hears, we're believing he's active, we're believing he's present. But on the other side, there's a little bit of us that thinks maybe God's indifferent, maybe God's inactive, he's never going to be involved. Maybe the pattern of the divine is to be absent when we really need him. I think all of us know what it's like to walk that tightrope. I can say in my own life, I don't think I've ever been 110% convinced that God is always present, that he always hears, that he'll always be active. I think I have stepped into that place, a bit of a grey unknown, where I've wondered, will God be active? Does he actually hear? Is he seeing this? Is he aware of this? Because sometimes that prolonged sense of difficulty kind of half convinces us that maybe God's forgotten the whole deal. And of course we have to come back to Scripture. In a particularly difficult moment in my own life, I remember having a lot of questions, significant questions, mainly questions like why? Why this God? Why him? Why this situation? Why did this happen? And of course in that moment, I was met with the silence of God and the inactivity of God. He didn't intervene to stop this situation happening. But I remember reading a book by J.I. Packer, and at the time J.I. Packer reflected on a similar thought, how difficult it is when we feel like our questions go unanswered. And there was a little statement he made that has marked me really, and made me really draw to a very different conclusion on the whole situation. He said, sometimes you have to learn to live with the whys in your life. And I think I came away from that thinking, it's okay to have questions. It is actually okay to have unanswered questions. You can still love God and yet feel at times confused about God. You don't have to have every I dotted, every T crossed to ensure that your faith remains rock solid. Sometimes the whole idea of faith is that it exists in the grey and the haze and the fog. Sometimes you just keep believing, even though there are huge whys over your life, just as Packer said. It's not always about getting the answer. It's not always about finding closure. Sometimes it's about walking in the dark and still trusting. Though he slay me, Job said, yet will I trust him. Each of us, I have no doubt at all, could probably reflect on the fact that we carry great pains and difficulties in our life. God is aware of that. God does not trivialize that. God does not ignore that. That is a very real part of our makeup. It's a very real part of our story. And it is very acutely aware that God is of that. He is intimately familiar with those moments. And that does not mean that because he is, we're going to get a magical answer of some kind, or we're going to get this super divine reprieve or this sense of relief that he'll no longer bother us anymore. I think sometimes we have to walk the heaviness with God. I know in my own life, when I've had those times of deep despair, I cannot say to you here and now that I prayed, I fasted, I read Scripture, and suddenly there was a wave of peace and contentment that came over me, and I was never troubled again. Not at all. Oftentimes it was a long journey back from those dark places. But I trusted that God somehow was connected to that journey. I didn't really have a lot of evidence to say that he was a lot of the time, but because I believed that God will do what God does, which is God is a God of love, he's a God of grace, he's a God of goodness. And because of that, I was trusting that my situation, that wasn't very good, would be healed in the character and in the goodness of God. You may be watching this and have been through something that you think, I don't know. God was absent at a period in my life when I desperately needed an answer. God was silent when I needed someone to guide me. And because of that, you may have said, I don't want anything to do with this God. Well, let me let you into a secret. Some of the best men and women of faith are men and women who could speak volumes on the silence of God and the inactivity of God. Some people have been through horrendous journeys and yet believed that somehow God was present, even though every physical evidence would speak against it. The wicked, the nations, David says, declare there is no God, based on their experience of he ain't getting involved, he ain't answering, he ain't intervening, therefore He ain't there. But that would be a fool's errand, because the reality of faith is that even though we may not see him, even though we may not sense him, God is always connected to what we're doing. He is always intimately familiar with every stage of the journey, and sometimes it is often hindsight that gives us that understanding. So can I encourage you, even in your deep difficulty, don't stop trusting. Learn to walk in the dark, because God is there and he's leading you to somewhere stronger and wiser. God bless you.